Thus far, we've seen a number of different kinds of experiments. We've seen experiments in the lab, we've seen some in the field, we've seen fully crossed designs, we've seen designs that are simple before and after designs, we've seen experiments which use students as participants, we've also seen experiments that use adults and people in the marketplace as participants. Let's think for a moment about how to organize the different kinds of experiments that we've seen. And I want to organize them into 3 sets of experiments. The first set is the lab experiments. And in particular, there are 2 kinds of lab experiments that we can do. You could bring people into a lab, you could ask them to make hypothetical choices that have no real consequences, and then analyze their hypothetical choices or the hypothetical judgments that they come up with. We saw an example of this in the past, the experiment about consumer credit and the fact that people tend to spend more using credit cards as opposed to check was an example of a hypothetical experiment. People hypothetically were given an income profile, they were given a savings profile, they were offered a hypothetical set of choices, and they were told that if this was the financial profile that you had, would you or would you not make the choice? So in essence, in that experiment, people were responding to a hypothetical set of circumstances. But you could also have experiments in which people come to the lab and make real choices that have real monetary consequences. The experiment we saw with Dražen Prelec and Duncan Semester, where they asked students to bid for tickets to a Boston Celtics game, was one such example. Participants came to the lab, they were put into different experimental conditions, but they then had to bid in an auction setting, and if in fact they won, they had to actually pay for the tickets that they bid for. So in a lab, you could again have 2 kinds of studies, hypothetical or studies with real consequences. The second set of experiments that I want to talk about are what we call natural experiments, or experiments using archived data. The world often conspires to create experiments all around us. For example, the laundry study was a natural experiment. It just happened that the management of the laundromat decided to switch from quarters to prepaid cards, and that gave us an opportunity to study its effect on a particular outcome variable. Likewise, there could be all kinds of other natural experiments. Sometimes the natural experiments happen without us even knowing that those experiments have happened. For example, Colin Kammerer and his colleagues were trying to understand the driving behavior of taxi cab drivers in New York. And they were simply trying to answer the question, does their behavior change as a function of whether they have a high wage rate day or a low wage rate day? Your wage rate is high on an average if it's a rainy day, there's a greater demand for taxis, if there's a convention in town. It is low when there is nothing out of the ordinary happening in that particular day. And essentially what Colin and his colleagues were able to do is they were able to simply look at archived data and look back at weather reports as well as history of conventions and so on and so forth to then try and match days on which they had records for driving behavior as well as the weather on that particular day. Or think about the euro in the 1990s. Back in the 1990s, when the European Union decided to switch away from their home currencies into the euro, there were some countries that had extremely numerous currencies. Think about the Italian lira, for example, that then switched to the euro. Beautiful natural experiment. Now you could look at the way in which the same people who spend numerous liras spend a smaller number of euros. So in sum, there are 2 kinds of experiments that the world conspires to create for us. There are some in which there's an archive of data that already exists. You might need to go out and collect and document that data. Or there are experiments in which the world conspires to create conditions for you, but you might need to go and ask people questions or observe behavior to document the effect of that intervention on people's behavior. And finally, there are 2 sets of experiments that we call field experiments, and they differ in the scale. Both in field experiments as well as what we call randomized controlled trials, the researcher actively goes out into the field and they come up with an intervention or a manipulation to look at the effect of a predictor variable on people's actual decision making. Think about the research we did in India, where we help people save more money by putting cash salary in envelopes. In that case, we had a few conditions. We had some laborers who got no envelopes. There were some who got plain white envelopes. There were others that got envelopes with pictures of their children on it. We had a small number of conditions, and we were able to document savings behavior by individually going and talking to each of those laborers over time. On a larger scale, you could think of studies where people have thousands and thousands of respondents. A study by Marianne Bertrand and her colleagues had as many as 15 to 16,000 respondents. What they were doing was they were working with a company that sends out mailings for loan products, and what they were able to do is they were able to manipulate the features of the mailing in order to see the effect on take-up or acceptance of those loan products. In their experiment, they had about 10 factors that they manipulated with about 2 or 3 levels each. As so you can imagine, there were a very large number of conditions. Now, if you put all of these sets of experiments together, you see a spectrum that goes from the very top, where you have simple lab experiments where people make hypothetical choices, to the very bottom, where you have fairly complex randomized controlled trials with lots of things being manipulated and with data collection being done in the field. What you get at the top is control. In a lab, you can make sure that all of your background variables are controlled. What you get at the bottom is realism. You make sure that what you are studying in this experiment is real, because at the end of the day, you're documenting real effects on real people making real decisions.